Hello, everyone. My name is Addie DeMary, and I am the Community Engagement Coordinator at Seward Co-op. Welcome to Community Conversations, exploring intersection of racial, social, and food justice. This series is presented by Eastside Co-op, Mississippi Market Co-op, Seward Co-op, and Twin Cities Co-op partners as a way to examine and connect our cooperative values with social justice movements. Before we start this evening, we will begin with a land acknowledgement. Minneapolis is located on land that is home to the Dakota people. It is important to acknowledge that this land was colonized by European settlers, but that it continues to hold historical, spiritual, and personal meaning to the Dakota. We want to honor the past, present, and future ties of the Dakota people to the land where Minneapolis now is. Whether we're Indigenous people or not, it is important to reflect on the complexity of our ties to the land and our role in moving the arc of history towards justice. This evening, we will have a panel discussion about the feature film, Jim Crow of the North by Daniel Bergen. Jim Crow of the North premiered in 2019 on Twin Cities Public Television. The film focuses on the complex history of racial covenants in Minneapolis and how systematic racism has lasting repercussions on housing inequalities in the Twin Cities today. We hope you had an opportunity to view this film in advance, but if you haven't, you will still enjoy an engaging conversation with our gracious panelists. A bit of housekeeping before we begin. Our evening will start with remarks from our panelists, followed by a Q&A session moderated by Clarence White at Eastside Freedom Library. We will begin with pre-submitted questions and, timing permitting, open the floor for more. Our evening will conclude at 8 p.m. With the large amount of attendees in this webinar, you are on mute and your camera is off for the duration of this event. You are welcome to put any comments in the chat box, and when it's time for the Q&A session, please direct any questions for our panelists into the Q&A box. Our featured panelists today are Daniel Bergen, Rebecca Walker, and Mia Ulysses. Daniel Bergen is a filmmaker of Jim Crow of the North and the winner of 15 regional Emmys. He has also worked on TPT films such as Out North, Lost Twin Cities, and North Star, Minnesota's Black Pioneers. You can find his works on tpt.org, and we will add some of the related works he has done to the chat box for your reference. Welcome, Daniel. Next, we have Rebecca Walker, who's from Mapping Prejudice, an organization of historians, geographers, digital humanists, and community activists. They are seeking to explore structural racism within land ownership to draw attention to the way race has shaped public space in the city. Welcome, Rebecca. And now we have Mia Ulysses, who is a fierce justice advocate and a community connector with roots in Minnesota and Haiti. She is passionate about creating more just systems through policy, food farming, land access, and natural spaces. Mia has impacted the Twin Cities community throughout her work on policy advocacy, program development, network building, and communications at organizations such as Loaves and Fishes, Worth Cooperative Grocery, Appetite for Change, 40 Acres Co-op, and Wilder Foundation. She has advanced local, state, and federal food policy efforts, including the establishment and funding of the Urban Agriculture Grant Program by the Minnesota legislature, one of the first urban agriculture specific state funded grant programs in the country. Mia is the principal of Rooted Solutions, a consulting firm that offers facilitation, program development, and strategic planning services to clients who would like a fresh approach to their work. Our panelists will each have 15 minutes to talk about their work, after which we will move to a Q&A. I am going to now turn over panelist introduction to Clarence from Eastside Freedom Library. Clarence, before you begin, would you like to tell us a little bit about Eastside Freedom Library and the work that you do?
Thanks, Addie. Welcome everyone to the Eastside Freedom Library. The Eastside Freedom Library does a lot of work holding difficult conversations in the hopes of building solidarity and justice for our community and the rest of the world. Over the past couple of years, the Eastside Freedom Library has held a series of events around housing justice, and we have created a housing justice program here at the library. We ran a series that began by the urging of ABC Realty, which is a boutique realty here on the East Side run by C.N. Thomas, who wanted to have conversations examining the disparity in home ownership that was very apparently different between people of color, African Americans, and Indigenous people, and white people. We have a very high home ownership rate among white people here in Minnesota. It is about a third of that for African Americans. That led us to hold several more events, several more panels, one of them including a screening of Jim Crow of the North, and Daniel Bergen was very good to join us for that, along with other people. We have had such a response to that we have continued the series even virtually. You can watch our website, our events page, as well as our Facebook page to see more on that, or visit our YouTube channel to see past events in that series. The conversations we have here bring in the greatest diversity of voices. We consider this place with almost 25,000 books as a place that holds a lot of knowledge, but it is also a place where a lot of knowledge is created and presented, because so many of the books are gatekept by a dominant culture and a dominant narrative, and we are doing our best to present a more rounded narrative, which is why we want to have this very important conversation following the message of a very important film that tells one of the truths that is a dynamic piece of why the society we live in looks the way it does. I wanted to mention a few upcoming events. On the 22nd of February at 7 o'clock, we are hosting, along with on stage, an event called The Most Beautiful Home, maybe presentation and discussion. We will have Maria Asp, Austin Van, and Jane Froyland, who will be reading part of a play that is upcoming and having a discussion around it. It's one of the things that we do. We partner with a lot of artists and arts makers who are having really crucial conversations and telling the truth around important issues. So that is going to be at 7 o'clock again on February 22nd. And it is, I think, a good example of how we have discussions that create change in our society and bring more people into a more rounded narrative of our spaces. The next day, on the 23rd, we will be hosting a program with civil rights activist Josie Johnson, talking about her book, Hope in the Struggle. She'll be in conversation with Tish Jones. I think a lot of people will really appreciate that. And I think a lot of the conversation will cover a lot of the ground that we're covering in this conversation tonight, and that is covered in the film Jim Crow of the North. So with that, I hope that we can get our conversation started. I'm so happy that we have our guests. It's good to see you again, Daniel, and I'm sure everyone is going to appreciate what you have to share with us today. So if you want to get this conversation kicked off, we are ready and happy to hear.
Well, thank you, Clarence. It's good to see you again. I'm sorry we can't be there together. The Eastside Freedom Library is a real gem, a jewel, and a great gathering place. And so I really encourage everyone to support, attend, and hopefully attend in real life at the Eastside Freedom Library. Way over on the east side. I'm coming to you from the south side. I'm here in South Minneapolis. I'm a South Sider born and raised. I'm, a couple blocks from George Floyd Square. But, one of the things of this conversation tonight is about the power of place. So whether it's a dope activist library, an important gathering place around food and food justice, like our co-ops. I really think that idea of power of place is a theme that runs through, and we'll run through this conversation. Jim Crow of the North, of course, looks at the kind of the hidden history and some of the dark history of restrictive covenants, and in this case in Hennepin County. And it was an important film, and I do hope folks have been able to watch it. If you haven't, as Addie said, definitely check it out. We'll touch on a lot of the themes here in our conversation tonight. But just really this idea of learning about the roots of systemic racism and how we got to now, and how Minnesota has some of the worst wealth and health disparities in the nation. This is one of the key elements to understanding that, is to look back into our past and see how, in this case, the restrictive covenants embedded in real estate and housing and land development a century ago led to the red lines that led to so many of the other forms of oppression and white supremacy that followed, that created some of the disparities we see today. Despite that, we persist, and that was important for me in the film, Jim Crow of the North, to also talk about, from a strength-based place, the Black communities and how we do. So, I'm in the basement, so I'm around my stuff, and so I did want to share that, I've got my Gordon Parks Life magazine, one of his more important photo essays on the Fontenelle family. And I think about the themes tonight, and this idea of food justice and, kind of the effects of poverty and white supremacy. And this kind of a low-fi version of like one of my documentaries where I just show you the photos. But really the idea of Gordon Parks, the master photographer, and he wouldn't call himself this maybe, but activist artist, is really where I get my kind of motivation, what informs me in terms of my films and my work with Twin Cities PBS, is really, in a way, that old journalist adage, that our work is to comfort the afflicted and afflict the comfortable. And so Jim Crow of the North is a case in point. So a really important film that has been, as Clarence mentioned, really its life began after it was on the air and online. And I think for my colleagues and myself at Twin Cities PBS, and if I can speak for the Mapping Prejudice team, just the life it's had in community has been really powerful and important, and it continues. And so we were thrilled that it was a part of this amazing housing justice movement that's happening, housed in the Eastside Freedom Library and in the community in St. Paul. I was going to share my screen, so forgive me for the brief technical clunkiness. Let's see here. But I wanted to just share a little bit about Jim Crow of the North and its impact. And if someone, Clarence, if you could just give me a holler if you're seeing food justice on the screen. Are you?
I am seeing that.
Right on.
Yeah.
Cool. So, Jim Crow of the North, of course, was an important film. Let me just back this up real quick. And I want to kind of allude to some of my other work, but with Jim Crow of the North, it's an important film and broadcast, and it lives online, but it really, right away, even at its premiere, here with Dr. Delagarde and myself at the U of M during its premiere in February of 2019, we saw, that power of conversation, of learning, of gathering around the narrative, and then, hopefully tipping that into action. And so this was the first of what now have been dozens and dozens of screenings and convenings and conversations in a range of settings, from church basements to community centers, and really just that idea of using this narrative and highlighting this history as a way for us to talk about the issues today and in the past. So it's been really powerful and I hope a useful tool. One notable screening was in Linden Hills in the park. You know, this is really the seat of the restrictive covenants in Minneapolis, but it was a jam-packed, sweltering park house on a summer day where it was standing room only, and folks came from all over the north side and elsewhere to kind of gather, talk about the issues of the film, and again, really look for action and solution and next steps. So really important. And, you know, we've gotten a lot of feedback at Twin Cities PBS, and I know my friends at Mapping Prejudice have as well, about, you know, how this narrative built on this stunning research and the kind of irrefutable power of this data about the impacts of systemic racism on our communities has continued to live on. One way it showed up that was powerful was bipartisan legislation, you know, spurred on by the Mapping Prejudice crew and their allies, and I think also kind of sparked by the film, to allow people to expunge racist covenants, restrictive covenants from their property deeds. You know, just one, you know, kind of a gesture, a bit of action. But since then, you know, from what I understand, and it's kind of cool because the viral nature of the film means for the Mapping Prejudice and my colleagues at TPT will hear about these different uses of it. And it seems to be on regular rotation at the legislature with different committees who are really looking hard at policy and planning about equity, reparations. My word, I don't know that they'd say that at the Capitol, but it's meant a lot that it has that role and it's been playing that role. You know, in my decades with Twin Cities PBS, I've done a range of productions and projects on a range of issues of concern in our communities. And really my last non-history documentary, because now I'm, as an executive producer, focused on history, was a powerful film for me to create called Food Justice that we did in association with St. Paul, City of St. Paul and Ramsey County Public Health, to really look at how we can make our food support systems more equitable. And as a, you know, food stamp kid and remembering the government cheese, you know, I'm a part of that lineage and legacy of food support. And so it was really cool to put a face on food insecurity and also kind of celebrate a lot of the great ways community takes care of itself and mutual aid, but also to say, you know, we need to make sure that there's healthy food in those systems. I wanted to just talk a little bit about, you know, if you've seen the film, you'll recognize this familiar image of the red line map, the FHA kind of outline of how they saw value in our communities. Of course, here's South Minneapolis. There's my home park, Powderhorn Park, where I grew up across the street from. And you see a lot of the blue areas, and then you see the familiar red down 4th Avenue. And I was thinking about this conversation and a lot of the great work a lot of you all do in the co-op world. And, you know, 38th and 4th, of course, is the historic intersection for the Southside's Black community. There was a lot of businesses there at one time, including a grocery store that you'll hear about when you talk to elders. Was thinking about co-ops and just quickly kind of poked around and you know, identified a few of the Southside co-ops that I think at this point in the late 70s you would see in South Minneapolis. There was also the Northside Co-op on West Broadway. And, you know, so you see these are really kind of in the heart of the community, including the Bryant Co-op on 4th Avenue, where Gary Cunningham and others, you know, had a real culturally focused co-op space. But now many of those are all gone, other than Linden Hills, of course, is still there. And, you know, I don't know, I'm not the Mapping Prejudice scholar, but it's no coincidence that it certainly spent most of its life solidly in the Green Line space, in the heart of the restrictive covenants in Southwest Minneapolis. I think it's moved even further west towards like Edina, but just thought I would share that as just kind of in a way, you know, for this conversation about food justice and the role of the co-ops, just that idea that there once were more in our communities. And then, of course, I love to have the friendship store in our neighborhood, and that's its own story. And I'm glad we got folks who can talk about that. My family are members, but it's just interesting how things have changed. And then lastly, on the co-op front, excuse me, I did want to mention that some awesome folks and friends of mine are producing an amazing film that I can't wait for you all to see called The Co-op Wars. And it really gets into a lot of the intricacies and the politics and the straight up throwdowns that were happening in the co-op movement in its early years. It's a fascinating documentary that I think will be a really powerful conversation piece. And we'll be broadcasting it. They're still finishing it, but we're in conversation, and I'm excited to bring that to you through TPT. But they're also doing community screenings, and if you check out their website, they're trying to organize conversations, special screenings with the film to talk about a lot of the issues that we'll be talking about today as well. So I appreciate the work they're doing, and I think it'll be, maybe as part of this series, even a good way to keep this conversation going. All right, I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and I think I'll leave it at that. Look forward to the conversation.
Thank you, Daniel. We really appreciate the added information, and I know it grows and gets updated every day. With that, I think we will pass it on to Rebecca to talk about the Mapping Prejudice Project.
Okay, thanks, and I'll share my screen as well. Hold on just a second. So my name is Rebecca Walker, and I am a researcher with the Mapping Prejudice Project. Full disclosure, I'm a new addition to the Mapping Prejudice Project, so I joined the research team at some point in the last year. It's kind of hard to say when I officially became part. I'm a student at the University of Minnesota, and my background is in environmental science. I study ecology, or I did, and over time I got involved with the Mapping Prejudice Project as I was studying urban environments and trying to understand some of the disparities we see in environments in Minneapolis today. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about that work because, one, I think it's important in its own right, and two, I think it helps us understand a little bit more about covenants not only shaped where people live. We talk a lot in Mapping Prejudice about how covenants establish this landscape of structural racism, and looking at the way in which covenants shaped investments in our environment, in Minneapolis in particular, can really show us a little bit about like what it means for racism to become institutionalized in this way. And so just to start us off and maybe put us in conversation with the events of this summer, so the Mapping Prejudice Project started in 2016 and have given hundreds of presentations somewhat like this, where they're talking about their research on covenants. And in each presentation, they would say Minneapolis has some of the highest disparities along racial lines in the country. And this isn't just unjust, it's unsustainable. And eventually our community is going to reach a tipping point. And this summer with the murder of George Floyd, I think we saw our community really reaching that tipping point. And the protests that began at the intersection of 38th and Chicago, they spread around our city and the Twin Cities and across the entire country. And became the largest protest in American history, with more than 20 million Americans marching in support of the Black Lives Matter movement. And in the wake of these events, Mapping Prejudice was increasingly called on to answer the question, why Minneapolis? Why did this happen here? And what should we know about Minneapolis? And so covenants are one part of that story. And we'll talk a little bit about how covenants really shaped this broader landscape of structural racism in Minneapolis. And so some statistics that Dan has already alluded to, and so I won't beat this into the bush too hard, but the Twin Cities have some of the largest gaps between Blacks and white people in terms of homeownership. There's a 50% gap, with about 75% of white people owning their own homes, while only 23% of Black people own their own homes. And that makes us the worst in the country out of 102 of the largest metros in the country. Similarly, so housing affects of everything else. It affects the schools you have access to. It affects the grocery stores you can shop at. It affects the air you're breathing. And so we see these disparities other metrics. So in our educational equity index, we rank 97th out of 100. And so these disparities are far reaching, and to understand these covenants provide a window for understanding where they came from. And so over the course of our research, as we've given these presentations, one thing that we've wanted to say again and again is that these disparities aren't the outcome of some like natural order. These disparities were produced actively through structural racism. And as we know through everybody who's watched Jim Crow of the North, racial covenants, there were these clauses that were included into deeds that prevented the sale of a home to anybody but a white person. And so they were first used in Minneapolis in 1910. Here we see the language from one of these racial covenants, and it says, the party or second part hereby agrees that the premises hereby occupied shall not at any time be conveyed, mortgaged, or leased to any person or persons of Chinese, Japanese, Moorish, Turkish, Negro, Mongolian, or African blood or descent, and said restrictions and covenants shall run, et cetera, et cetera. And you see sort of this like archaic racial language, and it sounds, one, obviously like very racist, and also just like so foreign to see this language here. And these were included in deeds. And so here are a few more. No person of any race other than the Aryan race shall use or occupy any building or any lot. The said premises shall not at any time be sold, conveyed, leased, or sublet, or occupied by any person or persons who are not full bloods of the so-called Caucasian or white race. No person of any race other than the Caucasian race shall use or occupy any building or any lot, except that this covenant shall not prevent occupancy by domestic servants of a different race domiciled with an owner or tenant. And the language here is, it's upsetting. It's you can feel the violence of the racism of this period in this language. And I wanted just to read them out loud as part of this conversation, because in America, we have a habit of using euphemisms to talk about race, or avoiding the subject, or using colorblind language. But ignoring racism isn't going to fix it. It's not going to make it not exist. And so part of the work of the Mapping Prejudice Project has been to confront this racism, and to confront this racist history. And so as part of our work, we've been working with the community to map these covenants. And so covenants, they've been we've known that they exist, but our understanding of sort of where they were or how they were used has really been lacking, because until the Mapping Prejudice Project, there hasn't been a map of racial covenants for any city in America. So this was the first one that really showed where these covenants were located, who put them there, for how long, how much land did they cover. And to make this map, we worked directly with community. So we had over 3,000 volunteers read covenants to make the Hennepin County map. And we had computers search through millions and millions of property deeds. And then from those, they identified ones with potentially racist language. Our 3,000 volunteers then read 177,000 of those historic deeds. And of those, they identified 24,000 that had a racial covenant in them. And so here we can see the results of all of that work. So what you're seeing, each of those blue dots represents the spread of covenants throughout Hennepin County. And each of those dots represents space that was for the exclusive use of white people. And so as I said already, this is the first comprehensive map that has been created for a city or a metro area in the country. and so the text I read out loud shows that covenants were racist, were quite violent, and this map shows you how widespread they were. And I also want to talk a bit about how powerful they were. So covenants ran with the land; they weren't attached to the person who enacted the covenant, but instead stayed with the property. So even after that property was sold to the next occupant, the covenant was still in effect. And it didn't matter how many times the property changed hands or what structures were built on the covenant or built on the property. The restrictions remained, and even after, and so if at any point the covenant was breached, the property would return back to the hands of the original owner or the person who originally enacted the racial covenant. And so these effects were long lasting, and were really hard to remove once enacted. And what's also important to hit is that, oh boy, oh geez, okay, sorry, is that these covenants were really popular. They were used by real estate agents as a selling feature to tout, come move to this property, your investment will be protected. And so they were really popular among white people. They wanted these covenants. And so in contrast, for Black people, they were a mark that this space was unwelcome to them, was actively hostile to them. And it was only through the work of Black activists in Minneapolis and around the country that covenants were ultimately overturned. And so eventually through a series of court decisions, starting with Shelley v. Kramer in 1948, and then ultimately the Fair Housing Act of 1968, covenants were made unenforceable. So I've talked a lot about sort of how covenants came to be and what they did, but then there's this question of, but how did covenants actually shape the landscape beyond just where people live? How did they shape the environment? How did they shape public education? How did they shape where libraries went? And so covenants were like this mechanism through which what was previously a relatively integrated urban landscape became segregated. And Black residents were increasingly pushed into just a handful of neighborhoods. And then these exclusive white neighborhoods became spaces of concentrated privilege. And while I'm talking about Minneapolis, this story isn't unique to Minneapolis. This was happening all over the country. And what I'm alluding to here is structural racism. And what does it mean for racism to be structural? Well, now that we have the covenants map, we can start to answer this question by looking at the way in which covenants shaped a whole range of systems. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about the effect of covenants on our park system in Minneapolis. And so Minneapolis is known for having a nationally award-winning park system. But one question, oh gosh, okay. But one question that we've been wanting, that the Mapping Prejudice team is curious about, is the way in which covenants shaped where investments in those parks were made and how that system evolved over time. And so to answer this question, I'll share a few examples from our research to highlight what we've been finding. So first is this is a plot from a development that had racial covenants. The land was developed by Edmund Walton, and he was the first person to enact racially restrictive covenants in Minneapolis. And Edmund Walton developed this land, and it's near Lake of the Isles. And included in this development, you can see Lot 5 here was basically a swamp, and it was muggy, it was bug ridden, it was swampy. You couldn't build a house there, and it made this development quite undesirable. But Edmund Walton had a plan for that. So just a year prior, Minneapolis's Park Board had built a canal that connects Lake of the Isles to Lake Calhoun. And this was met with huge fanfare. They had a giant civic celebration where hundreds and hundreds of people came to celebrate the linking of the lakes. And this was quite a big deal for the city. And there was also quite a lot of excitement about how this new canal was drumming up interest in the real estate market in this neighborhood. And so Edmund Walton saw an opportunity, and you can see here the canal zone lots are much in demand. Lake of the Isles district, they're saying it's not checked by May winter weather, which I think we can relate to the winters that drag on into May. But not even a terrible May snowstorm can deter people from coming to buy properties in this new canal neighborhood. And so Edmund Walton sees an opportunity. And what he does is take this swampy piece of land and say, hey, Park Board, how about you build a canal here too? And if you're familiar at all with Minneapolis's geography, you know that that there's a canal that runs from Lake of the Isles also to Cedar Lake. And so Walton donated this piece of land to the Park Board, and they did it. They built a canal. So you can see I've highlighted in this advertisement that was in the newspaper just a few years later, where the new canal between Lake of the Isles and Cedar Lake has been constructed. And Edmund Walton is talking about, come get in on this Lake of the Isles bargain. You take advantage of this beautiful natural amenity. And then if you look down at the ad, you also see he's advertising another amenity, and that is the racially restrictive language that is included in the property deeds. And so these environmental amenities through park spaces were used in tandem with covenants to increase the value in neighborhoods. And we know now today that the neighborhood around Lake of the Isles is one of the most expensive neighborhoods in the Twin Cities. And so the strategy was effective, and other real estate agents caught on. So this is along Minnehaha Creek. So Samuel Thorpe, through the Thorpe Brothers Company, developed this property, and they put blanket racially restrictive covenants on every lot in this development. And this was the first time blanket covenants were enacted in this way in Minneapolis. And just a few years after that, Thorpe donated 49 lots that were 49 of the lots that ran right along Minnehaha Creek to the board. He received $1 from the Park Board for those lots. And the Park Board built new parkland running along Minnehaha Creek, which is, as many of us who live in Minneapolis have enjoyed that parkland very much. And he did this to increase the value of the remaining properties that now lined this new park amenity. Here you can see developers getting pretty brazen in their collaborations with the Park Board. So this is Diamond Lake Terrace. Each property in this development had a racially restrictive covenant on it. And you can see this blob here is what became Todd Park, and they were including their donation to the Park Board directly in their map of the original development. So they, without even asking the Park Board, they were saying this will now be a park. And I've outlined that development here in this map, and you can see today the area that they had designated as a park has become Todd Park, and all of the properties surrounding that park had a racially restrictive covenant. And what this did in effect, so we've traced this history or this happening in dozens of parks in Minneapolis. So it's not just these three, it happened all over the city. Basically anywhere there was a covenant, they were also influencing investments in green space nearby. And this created a de facto Jim Crow system in our park system, where some parks, many of the nicest environmental amenities in Minneapolis, were for the exclusive use of white people. And this shows us a little bit about how racism in Minneapolis became institutionalized. Once that happened, these amenities are on our landscape. They're not going anywhere. Now we have this park system, and also the neighborhoods that had racially restrictive covenants are still today largely very white. And so this has long lasting effects. So here you can see a series of maps. The map on the far left shows racial demographics in Minneapolis, with lighter colors representing majority white neighborhoods, and the lightest colors around the lakes and around Minnehaha Creek are upwards of 90% white. And then the four remaining maps moving left, you have tree canopy cover, you have air quality, you have total park acreage, you have relative temperature. And you can see that all of these maps followed the same patterns with the most tree canopy cover and the best air quality and the most park acreage and the lowest temperatures being in these neighborhoods that were made exclusively white through covenants. And so through this, we see our landscape of environmental inequality developing in Minneapolis, and we see this hoarding of environmental privilege in these exclusively white neighborhoods. And so that leads to the question, what do we do? How do we fix this? And so part of this is continuing this work and building maps for other places beyond Minneapolis. So currently, the Mapping Prejudice team is working on developing a map for Ramsey County. So that's the county that St. Paul is located in. And one way, if you want to get involved, if you want to help, you can help. So we'll share the link to the Mapping Prejudice website, and we're looking for volunteers to help make the same map, the same kind of map for Ramsey County. And so you can go to our Zooniverse site, and then you too can read through the language of these deeds and identify the deeds with restrictive covenants. Beyond creating these maps, it's not enough just to know the history. We also have to have the history guide what we do now. And so if we've learned anything from the work of Mapping Prejudice and from the covenants maps, housing matters. And so really following the leadership of activists of color, particularly housing justice activists of color, will help us confront some of these disparities. So the Alliance is a housing justice group, and they have put forth this equity in place policy agenda that's really aimed at increasing access to housing and ensuring that that people have access to affordable housing and that they aren't displaced through gentrification. And so what we're really talking about here is reparations, and this can happen systematically. This can happen through how we invest in communities and ensure that those communities are able to stay in place and enjoy those investments. And I close with pictures from the summer just to point to the fact that if we don't make these investments, then these are the alternatives we're faced with. And so I encourage everyone to get involved and learn more and maybe help make some maps and think about what you can do to confront these systems. And that's it. I'll stop talking and turn it over to our other panelists.
Thanks, Rebecca. Great additional information and thanks. And the ways to get involved will, as a reminder, will be shared with everyone, because I know people have asked how they can get involved and also what's happening in Ramsey County and St. Paul. Our final speaker, Mia, will talk about the food system and food activism and how that relates to this housing discussion. So Mia, take it away.
All right, thanks, Clarence. Hi, everybody. My name is Mia Ulysses. I'm going to be talking about the connection between food justice and housing justice here in the Twin Cities. Let me pull up my presentation. All right. Awesome. So I love that there are so many points of intersection between what Rebecca and Dan had talked about already. And I think it's very interesting to see information data from a geographic perspective, because it's kind of like the proof from a food perspective, the proof is in the pudding. It shows us how our society has shifted or changed, how we see concentrated areas of oppression that are due to institutional racism, due to community-led oppression and systems of discrimination. And so I'll get a little bit into that, and I have a couple maps to share to add on to Rebecca's and Dan's as well, but hopefully you will be able to leave this session with the three of us today learning a little bit and knowing a little bit more about how you can contribute locally to fighting against food justice and housing discrimination. A little bit about me first, just so that you know who I am, because I'm assuming that the 200 people on this call probably don't know who I am. My name is Mia Ulysses, and I am born and raised in the Twin Cities. Like Dan said, I'm a food stamp baby, a WIC baby. Housing is very close to my heart just because I, by the time I reached adulthood, have moved over 16 times within the Twin Cities area and have really personally experienced that connection between housing justice and food and access. I was born to two beautiful parents, as you can see. My dad is an immigrant from Haiti and came to the United States when he was young. Met my mother in Minnesota. She's born and raised here in East Bethel up north. And they had me in addition to some other siblings. And I remember just having very different experiences and polarized experiences around food growing up. I would help my mom in the garden wherever we lived. And, you know, every time we moved, we would try to have some kind of garden, picking cucumbers, raspberries, planting rhubarb. And then I also had this experience of going to the WIC office and utilizing food stamps and WIC coupons at the farmer's market downtown Minneapolis, and biking to the grocery store in Brooklyn Park because our car was out of order. And so really having two different perspectives around food that still, for some reason, developed this like love and passion for eating food, for cooking food, for growing food. As you can see, I love to eat it. I love to cook it. It's been in my blood since I was a baby, and has really led me up to this journey of really understanding how all of these different pieces of our lives aren't segmented, but they're actually interconnected. And that's why when Rebecca shows you those maps of the city of Minneapolis and you see environmental pollution and you see population density around BIPOC representation and you see income and food access, all those are layered on, and you see that the same exact areas are being affected time and time again. A lot of my work has been around advancing urban agriculture efforts in the Twin Cities, working with grocery cooperatives, farming cooperatives, nonprofits across the state to help advance their efforts, to build out their programs, and to also advance policy efforts at the local, state, and federal level around making sure that urban agriculture has representation from Black and Brown communities, making sure that we have those who are working to build their farm operations that are teaching youth how to grow food up at the Capitol, advocating for the changes that they want to see, which has led me to create my consulting business, which is called Rooted Solutions, ironically enough. And I do a lot of work with nonprofits and co-ops across the state to help develop and create a strategic plan for the work that they want to do. So all of these things are, as we've kind of discovered through the documentary, through the conversations we've had already tonight, interconnected. This is a form of systemic oppression. Like Rebecca said, it is not something that just descended out of the sky. This is human-made, and it stems back to the very genesis of our country. If you look at the redlining map, which this was a part of the documentary that you have all seen to prepare for this event today, you see that the closest areas to the hyper point of downtown Minneapolis have been deemed as hazardous, definitely declining. And then as you move out to the outskirts where you see less developed land, that's where you have them labeled as best or still desirable. A lot of that has to do with the environmental waste and pollution that was taking place off of the river and our source of economy at that time, and the populations that were housed most closely to those areas of downtown Minneapolis. This is a map of Minneapolis taken from USDA census data from 2015. And these are areas that are designated as food deserts. And while I'm not super keen on the term food desert, I will use the information that we have right now to just demonstrate and show that the very same map areas that were designated as hazardous, the very same areas that we see to this day are designated as opportunity zones, as environmental justice zones, as green zones, are the same exact areas that we see have high population density around food access and food insecurity. So when I think about this, especially like from my lived experience, from the experience that I have working with people in community, a lot of this is really chalked up to economic mobility, and economic mobility as a vehicle, not just around income and not just about how much money you have, but around wealth, around land access, around land tenure. And those are common themes that you also see in the housing world around land. And ultimately, this is about the quality of life for you and your future lineage. If you look at studies around generational wealth, it's absolutely disgusting to see that the median net worth of Black households in 2016 was $15,000 compared to $140,000 for white families. That's literally a tenth of what we see for white families. And this is about like the perpetuation of that cycle of survival, working in nonprofit space, working in program development. You see so many people, and people like even like my family growing up, where you're choosing between paying your rent and buying groceries. You're choosing between buying groceries and paying your light bill. You're choosing between your light bill and your water bill. And so it's not as easy as just saying, well, if everybody just shopped at the co-op and participated in the Lime program and utilized the economic assistance, then everybody would be able to have good quality food that's locally sourced. It's not that easy, right? Because you're trying to survive. Maybe you're working 2 or 3 jobs. Maybe you don't have adequate access to transportation. Not everybody who is food insecure or faces housing discrimination lives in Minneapolis and St. Paul proper. And so as you get into the outskirts of the suburbs, the first ring suburbs, you start to find a lot of issues around transportation and access to food. You see discrimination and rental housing. I have been subject to discrimination in rental housing. I can count on so many fingers how many friends I have where they've gone to see a place, loved it, and they showed up and they're going through group showings because that's what they do now, and they're facing discrimination. People are saying, oh, we just got an application in, but then they hear someone showing the same place to someone else and they're saying that it's available. And so even to this day, you see a lot of those like undertones and themes around discrimination within the state of Minnesota. And then the biggest piece is really around inequitable neighborhood investment. This goes into, the maps that we saw that Rebecca had pointed out around, how is the city and our state and our federal government investing in housing in certain areas? Where are the grocery stores? Are there access to good quality schools? Are they properly funded? And that connection between food and housing has really started at the beginning in the genesis of our country, where Manifest Destiny was interpreted as this inevitable religious pilgrimage to conquer the land, the slashing and burning of indigenous crops, and the genocide of bison and buffalo for money and for sport. And really this idea that if you can weaken somebody's immune system, if you can take away their ability to sustain their life, and on top of that, if you can take away the very place that they call home, that in itself is a recipe for colonization and imperialism. You see that it happening in modern day practices, whether it's through discriminatory lending practices for Black farmers, whether it's for mortgage lending to BIPOC people who are trying to build their own generational wealth, whether people are trying to uplift their businesses. It's absolutely rampant. And my mother has worked in the commercial and the residential lending industry for over 20 years. And it's just really shocking to hear the stories that she tells me about clients that come to her that have a business plan that want to buy a commercial property. They happen to be Black, or maybe it happens to be in a historically Black neighborhood. And for some reason, the lender generally finds a reason not to fund it. The Pigford settlement is the largest civil action class lawsuit in the country in its history. And it was centered around Black farmers and discrimination from the USDA, which you find as a main theme in this country's history around Black farmers and Black Americans just in general, finding that they're facing discrimination from federal lending agencies, from private banks, private lending agencies, real estate, landlords. Even to this day, Black applicants are denied for initial mortgages at a rate 80% higher than their white counterparts. Even when they already have their home and they're looking to refinance, they're 2 times more likely to be denied. And then when they're getting to the point where they want to sell their house, it's been shown, and there are a lot of articles that have been in the news the last couple of years around people seeing lower appraisal values just because they have pictures of their Black families or their brown families in their house. And when the appraiser comes to evaluate their home, their house is appraised at a much lower value than those that are around the other area. And when this ties into food, most lenders don't actually fund farms, restaurant, food trucks, grocery stores. And so they either have to resort to their own personal savings, angel investors, and then the occasional food or farming focused lending program that on top of that may not necessarily be equipped to understand the history and the biases around Black and Indigenous people in this country. I love talking about modern day food apartheid. I think that it really encapsulates a stronger essence of what we are experiencing in this country than just saying that something happens to be a food desert. And much like redlining and other systems of oppression, it's a human created system that goes hand in hand with redlining. And in some ways, it's a form of food redlining to uproot and highlight white supremacy and classism. You see this where in cases of classified food deserts, oftentimes corporations will go in, they'll do a field analysis and they'll look at the zip code, they'll look at income rates, they'll look at racial and ethnic demographics, crime rates, home ownership rates, and they'll make their own determination of whether this seems to be a worthy neighborhood to put their business. And that's why historically, so many areas and zip codes and communities and neighborhoods that are historically Black and brown, that historically have been classified as food deserts, have a very hard time keeping and retaining food business industries because a lot of it is based off of racist and classist metrics. Even the school lunch programs that we see in the Twin Cities and the difference in terms of funding, a lot of inequities in terms of how schools are funded, how schools even in the same district are funded, and school lunch shaming and the stigmas around free and reduced lunch that still persist to this day. I remember I went to Earl Brown Elementary School in Brooklyn Center, and I remember there was one day where I wasn't able to afford my lunch, and they actually made me stay back from recess, and I couldn't go outside and play with my friends, and I had to clean the lunchroom because I couldn't afford, as a child, my school lunch. And then finally, farming is such a huge industry that we're trying to find ways to diversify. There are so many amazing BIPOC farmers that are really trying to break into this industry and have been trying to fight for their place in this world for generations. And in Minnesota alone, over 99%, so 99%, y'all, of farm owner operators are white. And that leaves literally 1% for every other demographic and ethnicity and culture that is not predominantly white in the state of Minnesota to identify as a farmer, owner, and operator. A lot of the barriers that farmers have around being able to operate a successful business are tied into the same things that you see in the food access world as a consumer, as somebody who's looking for housing, the ability to secure funding, and the ability to have access to land, feeling safe and welcome in those spaces, funding to be able to purchase equipment, are all huge barriers for farmers to try and uplift their businesses. A lot of people are renting lands, and honestly, like that's the same thing as sharecropping and tenant farming. And I understand that city governments are trying to find ways to increase different diverse farming operations and programs, but it's a modern version of tenant farming. It doesn't produce wealth for these BIPOC farmers in the way that they are allowing themselves to be able to actually grow their business in a sustainable way. At 5 years, if the city wants to sell that lot to a developer to be able to put in an affordable housing unit, they could. And then the thousands of dollars and the hundreds of thousands of hours of time that was spent into planning and volunteering and developing that lot goes away. And really just like understanding that privilege of having generational wealth, especially from a perspective of land from an entire country that is based off of colonization, that is based off of stealing land from indigenous people, is at the true root of where we see a lot of issues around land access and farming in the state of Minnesota. A majority of farms that are owned by farmer owner operators that are family owned have been owned by at least 2 generations within their family. And I understand that there are certain farmers that have a lot of pride around that. You want to be able to pass on your career to your children, you want to be able to pass that land on, but you also have to find a way to acknowledge the privilege that comes with that and the history that comes with that, because in order for you to be able to have that land to pass on to your children, there are indigenous people and Black people who have either had their land stolen from or have been promised an opportunity to be able to gain equitable access that have been lied to time and time again historically through policy and procedure at every stage of this country's development. And so you see that there are so many ways that we see housing and food interconnected into the work that we do around justice, around equity, around the fight for Black lives in the Twin Cities. These are just a couple ways that you can get involved. These are more food justice related. I'll be the first to say I'm not a total housing justice expert. There are tons of people in the Twin Cities that are absolutely much more versed in policies and other cooperative movements and land trusts that are building momentum around the Twin Cities that you could support. But right now, there are a lot of BIPOC farmers that are trying to lift off their operations. They're trying to close on land. They're trying to buy buildings. They're trying to buy processing facilities. There are so many GoFundMes out there that you can support. BIPOC farm businesses, food businesses, land trust cooperatives, a lot of these are not nonprofits. And while you can't get a tax write-off from it technically, these are places where they're going to include and infuse our economy down the line. These are spaces where I think that it needs our investment, especially because it is even more difficult for a lot of these businesses to be able to get support. It's not as easy for them to get grant funds or state funds or federal funds. A lot of them don't have someone that they can retain for, to write a $10,000 grant or to pay $10,000 to write a $5 million grant. And so our ability to say we are willing to invest our dollars individually and collectively as cooperatives, as businesses, as families is really important to be able to actually realize in a tangible way that we're caring about food justice. Giving back lands, there's a lot of movements in Indigenous communities around giving back land. I think it was Hennepin County, or there's a county in the state of Minnesota that recently gave back land to a tribe. And so we're starting to see the conversations around giving back land and around the reparations for descendants of slavery really being actualized. And I know Dan had said, I don't know if they're talking about reparations at the Capitol, but there absolutely are people that are fighting for that conversation. And you, as people who are living in the state of Minnesota, you all have representatives that you have either voted into office or who are representing you, whether you voted for them or not. And so calling them and letting them know that this is an important conversation to have can really push the dial and make sure that it can be a conversation to continue being had at the legislature. So this work is political. This work has taken the energy and the sweat and tears of Black and brown bodies since the genesis of this country. And so making sure that we're not forgetting that we have to get political with this process is absolutely important. So there are so many other ways, but I think I'm going to run over on time, or maybe I already have, so I will stop. But if you have any questions, I believe someone's going to be able to drop in one of my contact forms. This is my email, but the easiest way to contact me if you want to connect is through the contact form. So thank you.
Thank you, Mia. That was great. And the whole series of presentations have been great. This is the time when we move to the question and answer period. So our panelists will be available to answer questions. I don't know if we are, I'm still seeing the screen share up. I'm not sure if we're able to have all of the panelists visible now. I think, yeah, I'll ask the panelists to share their video. I'm going to jump in with the first question that appeared from what people who have viewed the movie sent in beforehand. And I'm going to paraphrase and embellish a bit. So I hope the person who posed the question is okay with this. But I think what the question boils down to is, why is Minnesota so bad? And what first comes to mind to me is a book that we've discussed here at the Eastside Freedom Library on more than one occasion by Christopher Lehman, who is a professor at St. Cloud State University, called Slavery's Reach. And it details some of the involvement and complicity of Minnesotans in the slave trade. And you know, that we think of that form of white supremacy being only in the South, when we know historically there was a lot of slavery in the North, especially in the New England states and the Yankee states, but also that this continues. And so why is it so bad? Is it something about the ethnic makeup and the origins of the people who are most in power here, or is it something else? I don't know if anyone has any ideas about that. Maybe it showed up in the mapping prejudice work, or maybe in some of your research, Daniel.
Yeah, I think you nailed it, Clarence. And Professor Lehman's work is stunning and chilling and important. And just that idea that Minnesota's roots are so tied in with money and resource taken out of the bodies of enslaved people. And this is, counties, this is land development, this is the University of Minnesota. Chris really breaks it down. It's powerful and important. And so I think that is part of it. Our origin story, of course, is about colonization. And so Minnesota's got a really grim history and some really powerful research that's happening on half-breed script, and just the kind of the original land grab, and just these really insidious ways that settlers and white robber barons were taking land. And we think of treaties, and in one fell swoop, indigenous people lost huge swaths of land. But there were other more complicated, like with restrictive covenants, more complicated ways that land was kind of pulled away from indigenous communities. And the half-breed script process of that hustle is one of them. And then, I would also just say that the Minnesota paradox is real. And, that idea that even in the forming of the state's constitution in the late 1850s, that you had a pretty robust abolitionist community and culture who put forth a constitution that would give African-American men the right to vote. And then you had the business side of Minnesota, largely in St. Paul, who were the ones who were friendly and welcoming to slaveholders, and that they put forward a different constitution saying, no, that ain't going to be a part of it. And that tension and duplicity and dichotomy of the Minnesota paradox, continues to this day. There has been opportunity, but there's been, some of the worst in the nation disparities. There has been progress, but there's been a lot of struggle. But I think you do have to look to those origin stories, those certainly 19th century, but even before that, with the fur trade and how race and money and land, come into play. But yeah, if I had to suggest one read right now, it would be Chris Lehman's book.
Thanks. Any other thoughts on that? Or,
I'll add on briefly, if that's okay.
Sure.
Just that one thing that that has really emerged for us through our research is that Minneapolis was really trying to frame itself as a progressive city, as a leader of cities, and so it was doing everything. It was trying to like really be cutting edge, and at the time when covenants first came into use, this idea of racial segregation was viewed as progressive and cutting edge, which is not to say that it is progressive or cutting edge, but just that that the very like racist and ideology rooted in eugenics really structured the way people were thinking about cities, and that was part of why Minneapolis so wholeheartedly embraced segregation and their planning, and how that became so deeply embedded here.
Yeah, I would also just offer, in terms of this theme of food justice, that Minneapolis as the mill city and the milling capital of the world, and around the time that the covenants were being embedded, is also about kind of that taking from the land. And there's a lot of really kind of compelling stories of progressive politics in terms of tensions between farmers and the industrialists in the city. But when I think of the indigenous community and I think of land, and that ultimately the wheat growing up on that Dakota land and Ojibwe land, kind of driving the mills, or being kind of put through the mills that drove the mill city. I think that this through line of food justice and injustice and land and appropriation is there too.
Thanks. I'm going to go on to the next question that came in early, and I'll read it here. I understand the covenants restricting groups from neighborhoods was in the interest of realtors, bankers, and others in the capitalist system to make money. However, the bigotry of ordinary people in restricted neighborhoods is something else. How are the churches, educational institutions, business organizations, etc., complicit in this type of white supremacy?
Yeah, I'll say one thing. I appreciate that question. And one of the things, Mia, I really appreciate about your presentation was all the specificity and really powerful facts, but also your personal lived experience, is important because this is personal. And so while we want to talk about systemic racism, we also do want to talk about that idea of interpersonal oppression. And we see that in the Lee House and a lynch mob of thousands, a couple blocks from where I am now, forming around. That was caused by covenants and these kind of barriers and white supremacy. But yeah, I don't want to take the humanity out of the oppression too and let people off the hook. So that's part of it. But yeah, I think to the question's point, for us, our movement, our institutions began in the church in terms of African Americans. So, the church obviously is the seat of the civil rights movement and all of that work. But yeah, all throughout South Minneapolis, churches were complicit, churches that now are seeing that and going through some reconciliation. I think I mentioned, I've been in a half dozen screenings of Jim Crow of the North in church settings where there's a degree of acknowledgement of those individual churches in their neighborhoods, and then this idea of those institutions writ large being a part of the problem. So, and that's what I love about where Rebecca is kind of showing us the mapping prejudice research is going, is that kind of sedentary suppression, that all of these institutions, organizations, places, they're all complicit. We're all complicit in this.
Yeah, I definitely agree with what you said. And it's really interesting because something that was very profound to me in the documentary is a woman explaining how she grew up on the South Side, and it was pegged as like this oasis, this beautiful paradise. And, who doesn't want to live in that, where you can feel safe going outside and you play until the sun goes down and then your parents call you in for dinner. And this idea and this reality that there are so many Minnesotans that have this same, rose-colored, rose-tinted glasses where they're like, well, I never even realized that this is going on. And then there's this polarized experience of people who have been othered where they're like, what do you mean? This has been my experience from the jump. This has been my grandparents' experience. These are my cousin's experience, my great aunt's experience, and a very different experience of living in Minnesota. And just like this insidious nature that so many things that are deemed progressive have come from the very people that colonized this land. And so what does it mean for someone who has contributed very drastically to the demise of our soil quality, to environmental pollution and environmental injustices, those who have taken land from indigenous people who have created policies that at the time maybe they thought were progressive, but really did a very large amount of harm to Black and Brown communities, to say, we are progressive. And I think that there is just this common theme that still happens to this day in 2021, where we do have a lot of Minnesotans that think that they live in a progressive state. We have a lot of Minnesotans that think, we voted Trump out of office. And so we did our part, pat ourselves on the back. But there are so many policies and procedures and small little things that add up onto someone's life who has a lineage of being systemically oppressed. And that's where it matters. And that's where it adds up into someone having a very, very different experience and having someone who took a total left turn while you were in paradise.
Thanks. Here's a quick question. A few people have asked this. What do you do if you find, and I think, Rebecca, you started talking about this, but what do you do if you find that there is a restrictive covenant on the deed of your house?
And I guess Stan talked a bit about this too, but now you can remove it. I know nothing about what the process of removing it is like, and Dan, I don't know if you can speak to that at all.
You know, a little bit, and I know Dr. Delagarde on your team is looking into you know, seeing folks through that process by way of example, perhaps. But so there is a way to expunge it. I think one of the things that the Map and Prejudice team is trying to work at is to work with the legislature to remove the cost, because it's not insignificant. I think it's like $60 or something. I mean, you know, so for some families at Linden Hills, that wouldn't be a problem. But what's cool, Clarence, is that a lot of people have expressed that, you know, this idea of exercising it as some way to push back. Of course, the researchers would remind us, we don't want to delete this. We don't want to in any way obscure it from the public record, because that's the power of Mapping Prejudice, is you cannot deny this anymore. There it is in black and white. But I love that idea. I love even some of my friends in the community, some of the artists, you know, some of the arts activism swirling around, like Pillsbury House Theater, talking about, you know, lawn signs with the covenants, you know, where folks can put something in their window, like, you know, this house has it, or the words of the covenant, you know, just by way of making it like the bronze, the Seytu Jones kind of marker at the Lee House, you know, ways to mark those covenants, to call it out, I think is important, to continue to drag it kind of out of the shadows and into the light. And maybe that could go in the reverse too, is, you know, and those of us in or near redlined districts, you know, maybe having the same kind of way to call that out, and how we thrived in spite of, you know, some of that oppression. But I'm sure Mapping Prejudice probably has info, if you went to their webpage, on how to take those steps and to expunge the restrictive covenant from your deed.
Great, thanks. There was another question that was submitted talking about the freeways and the freeway system. And I noticed, looking at the map that you posted and seeing the maps in the film, you know, they seem to go, the freeways seem to go pretty close to those red areas, you know, or right through those red areas. I mean, there's a lot of history here in St. Paul about the Rondo neighborhood and how the freeway went directly through there. People don't talk as much about 35W. So maybe you can talk about that, and maybe, you know, that history in other parts of the country. And this viewer also asks about the Fair Housing Act of 1968. Has that been fully realized, or how long did it take for that to have an impact? Is it fully realized? And, you know, is that still a good vehicle to pursuing justice?
Yeah, Rebecca, I'll be interested to hear you and Mia's take on this. I will say, to the last part first, you know, the Fair Housing Act is just that. You know, it's just a piece of legislation, and it can be undone, as we're seeing with Voting Rights Act. I mean, so that we have to, I think sometimes we kind of deify some of the civil rights legislation like it's carved in stone, and it isn't. And so you give the market an inch and they'll take a mile, and we would lose a lot of those. And we already have in different ways. It's about enforcement. And so, you know, HUD are kind of the guardians of the Fair Housing Act. And I did a Jim Crow the North screening at the HUD offices, and a lot of their, especially younger, you know, staff didn't know any of this history. That was why their bosses dragged me in and said they need to see this. This is our job. But you know, it did largely kind of root out and make illegal a lot of the practices after a series of court cases. But you know, obviously, as we all know, the damage was done to a large degree. But the other part of that is real estate, banking, insurance, those other facets of the kind of housing economy are still rife with it. You know, people getting steered by real estate agents. The cool thing I will say, and I am sometimes the hope guy, is that like in some of our Jim Crow the North screenings, we've had realtors who talk about their role in, you know, the problem, but also the solution. And of course, Clarence, that's what's been really dope about the movement in St. Paul that you all are a part of, is seeing ABC Realty and just really this commitment from realtors to try and be a part of the solution. But freeways, yeah, it's in every Black community. This is a national thing. Right on Rondo, I'd be, you know, that's the one we know, but yes, 35W devastated the South Side. The North Side was affected by, you know, not only freeways, but other infrastructure that carved up. You know, it's funny, it's ironic, I guess, that the farmers market is in a place adjacent to what used to be one of the old North Side communities, more proximal to downtown. But so you talk to an elder on the South Side, they'll mention Central High, losing Central High, and the freeways, and it's real. But Rebecca, I'm curious about one of the things I've been anxious about with the Ramsey County research with mapping prejudices. So we know about Rondo's destruction, but, you know, like, to what degree did covenants create the green line and leaving that as the red line, perhaps, and then was part of the justification for the ultimate destruction? Are you all starting to see some of that?
Yeah, I think that some of that is starting to emerge, and I think that that's definitely part of the pattern that we see in Minneapolis. And so I'll be curious to see the answer to that question too, as that map comes together. I think that the question about highways is so important for thinking about access to food and just like how highways cut neighborhoods in half and really created barriers. I know through some of the research that people have done on the history of 35W, people have talked about how the neighborhoods to the west of 35W really policed people of color coming across that barrier once it was erected, and thinking about the way that that 95 also, or 94, cuts off communities from the south side from downtown, and how that shaped who has access to what food, and also the environments. Highways are obviously a huge source of pollution, and so putting a freeway through a neighborhood can have devastating effects on environmental quality, or your access to the riverfront if you're in the north side. And so I think that that's really important to think about, and the way that covenants shaped what neighborhoods were not deemed valuable, and then this idea, this like science of valuation, which of course is a completely arbitrary thing, was used to justify the destruction of communities of color through highway development. Yeah, Maya, I don't know if you have anything you want to add. I would love to hear your thoughts on it too.
Yeah, I don't have anything to add particularly on highways, but something that I do want to note that maybe not everybody knows about intricately that pertains to housing is that it's not just about like HUD or FHA or lenders around discrimination. It's so much deeper because there are so many hands that touch your documents, that so many people and different roles that you have to interface with to even get to the point of buying a house. Even I'm a renter, I'm trying to buy a house, and it's ridiculous how many loops. So you can have one person that can spin everything up. And it kind of goes back to the slide that I had around discriminatory lending. You know, you could have a lender that could, you know, put your deal wrong. Even like the fact that when people are putting in offers for your house, technically speaking, you know, there's nobody standing over your shoulder telling you, oh, you know, you can't deny that person. Oh, you can't deny that person. You can sift through soft offers as you want. I know there are a lot of people who have mentioned that, you know, they've been passed up. Even for like young people who are trying to buy houses right now, I'm being passed up by people who can pay the full price. FHA loans are generally viewed as lesser than conventional loans because FHA loans require stricter requirements. And so if the paint is chipping and the windows are too old, and if your foundation is settling or it's got a crack and the person that comes out and does the inspection doesn't approve you, you're not going to get that loan. But someone that goes through a conventional lender that doesn't have the strict requirements is more apt to get that loan. So you're placed at a disadvantage. It's a seller's market right now. And so people are paying above market price. And for people who have access to generational wealth, people who have higher paying jobs, people who have parents that can help them put a down payment on their house, people who don't have student loan debt, people who have like white passing and white privilege that can walk through and potentially, be able to secure a deal more quickly than someone who has darker skin. Like those are all like very real advantages that are very, very hard to prove in an aggregate sense on a federal level, because these are individual experiences that oftentimes are discounted because Black and brown people are constantly gaslit into making us believe that we just had a one-off experience and that it's not a pattern. And even from a lending perspective, my mom, when she's going through and trying to process loans, she asks people their racial demographic information, but even our own data has been used against us. So some BIPOC people don't want to disclose their demographic information because they feel like it might be used against them. And then even when it is disclosed, when there are people that are trying to open up cases at a federal level and a national level or even a state level around lender discrimination and bank discrimination, most of the times they fight tooth and nail to not disclose racial demographic information that is tied to the applicant, because if they did, they know that people would see overarching patterns around why they're getting denied. And so you have this ice age old federal legislation that literally doesn't do anything because people are so keen on finding ways to discourage and discount the experience of people, and also creating systems that are very arduous so that people can't actually prove it and actually change policy on a federal level to make sure that discrimination doesn't actually happen.
So we've done dozens of Jim Crow Lenore screenings and discussions. This has never come up to that powerful and specific recounting. Thank you so much, Maya. I mean, that's powerful. And that is all not about, frankly, restrictive covenants in history. That's kind of lived experience every day. And those are systems that are harder to change. They're individuals. So thank you. Also, you mentioning renters, because that is a huge omission, obviously, in our history. And Kirsten Delegard and I at all these screenings often kind of feel that absence that we didn't address in the work, renters. And so for a lot of people, that's really front and center. So thank you. Wow.
Yeah. Even landlords saying, oh, you can't have aggressive breeds, you can't have pit bulls. Honestly, for me, like that's another form of a racial covenant, because if you look at people who have pit bulls who are 9 times out of 10 not vicious, not out here attacking, and people are using racial stereotypes and caricatures of people using them to fight other dogs or having little chicken rings in there. I don't know what they're thinking about, but it's not true. And that is a type of a racial covenant that is used to push people out because there's nothing that they can do about it.
Yeah, we only have a couple of minutes left. Yeah, thanks for adding that to the conversation, and that those practices are historical. I know my mom talking about my grandfather buying his house, that he had to go to the grocery store down the street and get a loan from the grocer at a very high rate and pay a lot more for his house than a white person would have to. I don't know, Addie, if we can do one quick question before we go, or do we need to? I know there've been a lot of really good questions that we just can't get to, and I'm sorry for that, but some of them have been answered, by the way. I'll let you captain this for the moment.
No, we don't. We only have 2 minutes left. Could it be like a quick question? Because we only have like about 2 minutes left.
Well, here's a quick one that you can just say, maybe someone hasn't answered this. One viewer's asking, are there communities like that of Columbia, Maryland, in 1967 between DC and Baltimore, which was created as an integrated community that pushed against the redlining and segregation? Was there anything like that in the Twin Cities that any of you know of?
What was the question again? Resisting, because resistance has always been a part of the story.
Well, resisting by intentionally creating an integrated neighborhood.
Yeah, I mean, in the film, we learn about, the Tilson built homes as one example of some effort to use kind of market and government sanctioning to create open housing, as it was referred to, where African Americans would actually be allowed to buy on the open market. You know, and so that's important, but I also love the stories of folks who cross the line. And, you know, again, you talk to elders and you'll hear about how they just made it happen, and just imagine the courage of knowing that, you know, you're going up against that. And frankly, of some of the folks, some of the white folks who defied the covenants and said, I'm selling anyway, much to their realtor's chagrin. Those stories are there too. But yeah, and I think that's important for us to find ways to surface how we broke through some of these systems.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you for joining us tonight. We are grateful to Daniel, Rebecca, and Mia for their time and expertise. And thank you to the Eastside Freedom Library and Clarence Wright for moderating this evening. If you'd like to join us donating to the Eastside Freedom Library and Mapping Prejudice, please visit their website, and the links are available in the chat box. And on behalf of the Twin Cities Food Co-ops, we would like to invite you for our next community conversations event in June, where we will celebrate Juneteenth and explore the role co-ops played in the movement for racial justice and abolition. We'll look at the intersection of art and social justice movement with a conversation with Save the Board to memorialize the movement, a group dedicated to preserving the mural art that was created as a response to the killing of George Floyd and social uprising last spring. So keep an eye on that on your co-op's website over the coming months for more details about the event. And again, thank you all to the panelists for joining us today. Great discussion, and I hope everyone has a great night.